My favorite writer of all time is Christopher Hitchens. His writing instilled in me a number of values, including that there's no virtue, honor, or authority in being in the majority, and that wish thinking is contemptible. I think this is one of the reasons why I talk about Kyle Kulinski as much as I do. I can't think of anyone who invokes public opinion more than he does, and he almost always does it in a way that's completely self-serving. Despite the fact that the politicians he supports lose more often than they don't, he always goes back to the idea that if only politicians in Washington embraced his politics, they would win landslide elections. Now, it's time to play one of my favorite secular talk clips of all time.
Politics is an easy game that we make difficult. All those overpaid Democratic strategists in Washington, D.C., they're useless. So we have the answers. Now it's just time to implement them and fight for them and be unapologetic on that front. And if you do that, the Republicans will be in a permanent minority from now until the end of time.
His go-to example for this, outside of opinion polls, of course, is the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. After all, FDR is considered by most to be a left-wing president, and he was incredibly popular in his time, so much so that he did, indeed, win 4 national elections quite handily. On top of that, Democrats dominated the House and the Senate during FDR's presidency as well. So, the logic goes, since FDR implemented left-wing policies and spoke with left-wing populist rhetoric, and since he won landslide elections, similar policies and similar rhetoric today would produce similar results.
This is my new favorite fact. I already brought it up like 3 times in the past 5 minutes, but in 1938, after FDR had been president for a little while already, Democrats controlled 80% of the House of Representatives and 80% of the Senate, and FDR got reelected 4 times because Americans got a tiny little taste of social democracy, and they said, yes, yes, you're materially helping me and improving my life. I love this. I want to vote for you nonstop. Which is what happens when you materially improve people's lives. So if legislation like this got through, people's lives would be improved, and then the Democrats would be rewarded at the ballot box.
There are a number of problems with this line of reasoning. To suggest that FDR's popularity was due to his left-wing policies is surely cherry-picking. There was a lot more to the 32nd president than Social Security and some public works projects. Would Kyle also argue that FDR's 1932 victory was attributable to his opposition to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act? Would Kyle argue that his 1936 landslide re-election was due to his partial repeal of that act? Imagine suggesting that his 1944 re-election was due to Japanese internment camps, or that his 1940 re-election was due to his attempt to pack the Supreme Court. Ironically, his last 2 re-election victories probably had more to do with World War II than anything with the New Deal. Of course, even if I was to concede that all of his election victories were due to progressive policies, 2 can easily play at this game. FDR's most impressive victory was in 1936, when he won 46 of 48 states, with a total of 523 electoral college votes to 8. This is comparable to Ronald Reagan's 1984 re-election efforts, where he carried 49 states and 525 electoral college votes to 13. Last I checked, 1984 was a lot more recent than 1936. Ronald Reagan ran explicitly against the government and left-wing programs, specifically those of the Great Society, due to his overwhelming victories in 1980, 1984, and his VP win handily in 1988 prove that people are opposed to left-wing policies? By Mr. Kulinski's logic, it certainly should. Or consider the 1972 election, when Richard Nixon won a 49-state landslide against progressive, anti-Vietnam War Senator George McGovern. Nixon famously claimed that he represented the silent majority that was quietly supportive of the war effort. Given the victory he had, that would appear to be the case. Nixon was never loved by the public, but he was able to successfully characterize his opponent as a left-wing radical, accusing him of being in favor of the 3 A's: abortion, amnesty, and acid. Does this prove that conducting foreign wars in Asia and characterizing your opponents as far left are the keys to winning landslide elections? I wouldn't go that far. But if you're going to accept Kyle's logic that FDR's victories prove that embracing leftist policies are a winning strategy today, then it seems to me you would have to necessarily accept these arguments as well. And like all of Reagan's victories, 1972 has the advantage of being considerably more recent than FDR's elections. The fact of the matter is, it doesn't really make sense to draw conclusions like these from previous elections generations ago. So many relevant variables in politics change from election to election. The important issues that the public has to consider aren't always the same. Think about it. Probably the biggest issue of the 2020 election was COVID-19, a virus that, as its name suggests, started to exist in 2019. Each and every election is unique. Furthermore, our political parties have changed as well. There used to be plenty of liberal Republicans. There used to be lots of conservative Democrats. Now there's what? Joe Manchin? Maybe Kristen Sinema? That's about it. Though, for as much as things do change, there are some constants in American politics. Ironically, Kyle invokes one of these constants as an obstacle against Democratic majorities going forward. Right before that clip I played earlier, Mr. Kulinski mentioned a built-in 6-point advantage for Republicans. He's responding to Mitch McConnell, who said that Joe Biden doesn't have a mandate because, unlike FDR or LBJ, Biden doesn't have overwhelming majorities in Congress.
The FDR point is hilarious. Now, to be fair to him, he's saying, like, he just means in the breakdown of the Senate. Like, they have a slim majority. They don't have the majorities that FDR had. And that's true. Biden has a slim majority. He doesn't have the majority that FDR had. But what he doesn't understand is, if legislation like this, in its entirety, was implemented, Democrats would have that kind of a majority. Assuming you, of course, limit the gerrymandering and people have their voting rights and the Republicans don't have a built-in 6-point advantage, which they currently do.
When he talks about voting rights, he's referring to legislation that is supposed to prevent so-called voter suppression laws, like voter ID and limitations on early and mail-in voting. Progressives, including Kyle, tend to believe that these laws disproportionately target minorities, who disproportionately vote for Democrats, and are therefore inherently skewed in favor of the GOP. We'll revisit that subject later. But for now, let's briefly talk about gerrymandering. As most of you probably know, gerrymandering is the drawing of districts in a way that benefit partisan ends. First of all, there's an obvious fallacy here that is usually overlooked. Gerrymandering is done in blue states to advantage Democrats as well. You just don't hear about it as much as you do when Republicans do it in red states. But more importantly, gerrymandering goes back a very long time in American politics. You know it's ancient because the Jerry in gerrymandering is named after Elbridge Gerry. When was the last time you met a dude named Elbridge? Gerry was our 4th president, James Madison's vice president from 1813 to when he died in 1814. Before that, he was the governor of Massachusetts. In 1812, he signed new state senate districts into law. One of those districts vaguely represented a salamander. So the Boston Gazette dubbed the practice of drawing districts for the purpose of political advantage with the portmanteau gerrymandering. Despite the fact that Jerry apparently didn't care for the way the districts were drawn, the term has stuck with us ever since, and has been a practice of both parties in American politics. And yes, that includes the Democrats during the New Deal era. In fact, the Democrats were so good at gerrymandering that it helped them maintain congressional majorities from the New Deal era all the way through to the early 1990s. Over that time period, these majorities passed all sorts of legislation, much of which Kyle probably wouldn't approve of because it certainly wasn't progressive, and yet Democrats kept winning re-election. I wonder if Mr. Kulinski would like to draw some conclusions about the electorate in regards to that. While we're on the subject of gerrymandering, I want to note that, while I do believe that it's undeniably a factor in determining who wins congressional seats, it's extremely overrated. Lots of people have studied this issue in lots of different ways, and most conclude that the impact of gerrymandering is usually overstated. Various studies have been conducted simulating elections with different district shapes, and the conclusion is that rarely, if ever, does it affect which party holds a majority in Congress. As Eric McGee, a political scientist who has conducted one of these studies, wrote over at Monkey Cage, that even if you game the assumptions in favor of Democrats in the 2012 election, they do gain more seats under the simulation, 7 more total, but fall short of matching their predicted vote share. The point should be clear. Even if under the most generous assumptions, redistricting explains less than half the gap between vote share and seat share this election cycle. From what I've seen, this is true of other recent congressional elections as well. One of the contributing factors to this, one that is particularly relevant to what we're talking about today, is that Americans are sorting themselves into much more ideologically homogenous communities. State legislators don't have to pack voters into districts when voters are doing it for them. As Bill Bishop writes in The Big Sort, Why the Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart, as Americans have moved over the past 3 decades, they have clustered in communities of sameness, among people with similar ways of life, beliefs, and, in the end, politics. Little, if any, of this political migration was by design, a conscious effort by people to live among like-voting neighbors. This is not conjecture. Bishop presents good data to back this up. The trend seems to have started in 1976.
After 1976, the trend was for Republicans and Democrats to grow more geographically segregated. The simplest way to describe this political big sort was to look across time at the proportion of voters who lived in landslide counties, counties where one party won by 20 percentage points or more. The 1976 election between President Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter took place at the time after World War II when Americans were most likely to live, work, or worship with people who supported a different political party. Just over 26% of the nation's voters lived in landslide counties. Then, the country began segregating. In 1992, 37.7% of American voters lived in landslide counties. By 2000, that number had risen to 45.3%. In the polarizing and close 1968 election between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, 37.2% of voters lived in landslide counties. The last 5 presidential elections have all had a higher percentage of voters living in landslide counties than in 1968. Beginning in 1992, the percentage of people living in landslide counties began an upward stair-step progression, and by 2004, in one of the closest presidential contests in history, 48.3% of voters lived in communities where the election wasn't close at all.
I bring this up because our boy Kyle thinks that landslide national elections at the presidential level of our past are still within the realm of possibility. Personally, I'm skeptical. Consider this. In 1944, FDR beat Republican Thomas Dewey in the Electoral College, 432 votes to 99. That's 36 states to 12. In 2008, Barack Obama beat John McCain by 365 electoral votes to 173. Obama carried 28 states as well as Washington, D.C. and Nebraska's 2nd District, neither of which had independent representation in the Electoral College in 1944, to McCain's 22 states. The thing is, the popular vote in each election was virtually the same. FDR had a 7.5% victory to Obama's 7.2% victory. Obama won handily, whereas FDR ran up the score. A 7-point victory just isn't what it used to be because the country has changed. We're far more ideological than we used to be, and sorted ourselves along those lines. I want to close this video by revisiting the issue of voter rights. As I explained before, Kyle, like most progressives, considers things like voter ID laws to be violations of these rights. They typically refer to these laws as voter suppression laws, and they frequently call for legislation curtailing such regulations. I'm not here to adjudicate the wisdom of these laws, though I should say that calling them voter suppression is, at the very least, an exaggeration. What isn't an exaggeration of the term voter suppression is what the Southern Democrats did during the New Deal era. From post-Reconstruction until relatively recently, the Democratic Party had a virtual monopoly in Southern politics. On top of that, they were a cornerstone of the New Deal coalition. At their height, Southern Democrats represented 2/3 of the coalition. At their lowest, they never dropped below 40% of the total elected representatives. None of the New Deal legislation that so many online leftists admire would have been possible without this delegation. In fact, FDR would never have received the Democratic nomination at the 1932 convention without the Southern delegation, as their votes put him over the top on the 4th ballot. So, how did the Democratic Party maintain a political monopoly through all those years? Well, as I said earlier, voter suppression certainly helped. Literacy tests, poll taxes, all-white primaries, and other Jim Crow laws targeted at black people helped maintain Democratic majorities in the old Confederacy. Those were just institutional measures. Never mind the de facto voter suppression done through intimidation and violence against Southern blacks. As Ezra Klein writes in Why We're Polarized, the fact that the South felt it needed something akin to a diplomatic strategy with the rest of America is little surprise. The Civil War was only 100 years in the past at the time the Civil Rights Act passed. And during that interregnum, the white South had been trying to balance its top domestic priority, the enforcement of white supremacy held in place by the dual weapons of law and violence, with its forced membership in the broader United States. The Southern Democratic Party was the vehicle through which the white South negotiated this tension. Put simply, the Southern Democratic Party was an authoritarian institution that ruled autocratically in the South and that protected its autonomy by entering into a governing coalition with the National Democratic Party. The Dixiecrats gave the National Democrats the votes they needed to control Congress, and the National Democrats let the Dixiecrats enforce segregation and one-party rule at home. So we see that politicians of many different types have won landslide elections, not just progressives. We've also seen that much of the New Deal coalition was built upon voter suppression. and that gerrymandering was undeniably a part of this. The thing is, I don't mind saying that FDR was an extremely popular president, and that much of his popularity was due to his New Deal programs. I don't even mind saying that a progressive could win a significant political victory in the United States. My argument is that one isn't predictive of the other. A landslide today wouldn't look like it did in the 1930s or 40s, and FDR's victories in those days don't necessarily prove anything for progressivism today. Anyone who suggests otherwise is simply cherry-picking. Any policy wonk who tries to make things that simple is just selling you some wish thinking.